I'm Carmine Gallo with Leonard Mlodinow. He is a theoretical physicist and a best-selling author of books like Subliminal, The Drunkard's Walk, and two books that he co-authored with Stephen Hawking, The Grand Design and A Briefer History of Time. Can't wait to talk about that. Oh, and by the way, on the side, Leonard also writes for television episodes like Star Trek, The Next Generation. In other words, the world's most interesting man. Is that right, Leonard?
That's right. I don't often drink coffee, but when I do, it's out of this white cup.
We are going to talk about your book, Emotional, and how feelings shape our thinking. I've read this cover to cover, and I can't wait to dig into it. But first, I hope you don't mind, Leonard, if I fanboy out a little bit over you, because I've long admired in your other books and in some of the publications I've read, I've long admired your ability to make science accessible. That is a unique skill. Where did that come from? Where did your storytelling skill come from?
Well, it's always been a passion of mine. I started writing short stories in third grade.
Oh.
So along with science, math, science, and writing, those have been my passions ever since I was a child. I think that's true of most people. You can see their passions as adults, even when they're children. And so I've been writing for a long time, and I'd like to think I'm developing my craft over all those years a little bit. And so I, of course, short stories are fiction, and I wrote for television, and I wrote a lot of fiction, but I try to bring those things that I've learned in writing fiction to my nonfiction in terms of pacing and making sure the audience is engaged and interested and having dramatic moments, humorous moments. So even though it's science, I'm not writing textbooks. My philosophy is to illustrate and clothe the ideas that I'm presenting, the scientific ideas, in something that is relatable and interesting to the reader.
Leonard, let's start with a two-part question. First, what did you learn from Stephen Hawking about communicating complex science to civilians, to non-experts? And second, and related to the first part, what tips do you have for communicators in any field who need to make complex ideas or products understandable and accessible?
Well, first of all, don't underestimate your audience. So I think the worst thing you can do is talk down to the audience. You have to assume that the people are reading your book or listening to your talk because they're interested in the subject, and you have to assume that they're intelligent. So you don't want to use a lot of jargon or technical ideas that they don't understand because they haven't been exposed to, but you also don't want to oversimplify things. So it's a bit of a balance there. But I think one reason that Stephen approached me to write with him is that he liked the fact that I'm a storyteller, and when I write my science books, I incorporate stories, and I also incorporate humor. You mentioned that I wrote for Star Trek. I also wrote for some comedies back in the day, like Night Court. Remember that?
That's right. Yes.
So I used to have a sense of humor, right? And that's not like I put jokes in, but I try to write with a light touch and a sense of humor, and something that might be amusing, at least, that'll keep the reader's interest. So you really want, whatever the science is. One thing that I think I learned from Stephen is that no matter how technical the science seems, you can make it relatable to the audience. When I write my psychology, neuroscience books, that's pretty easy because I'm writing about who you are, your mind, how you work, what you think about. But what Stephen showed was that even when you're writing about cosmology and the beginning of the universe, that can be made, that's relatable, and people really do pick it up for that reason. Why do you think people are interested in that? Unless they're physicists, they're interested because they want to know what their place is in the universe. How did we get here? Why is the universe that we live in the way it is? And so when you're writing about that, you don't have to put equations in and write in a purely technical manner. You can tell stories. We use historical stories. We speak philosophically, speak about the ideas and what they mean for us. So that's one thing that Stephen really was a pioneer in, and I'm following that tradition. And
I've noticed that I've noticed that about Hawking because I think I have a quote that I've used before from Stephen Hawking. And he said, my original aim was to write a book that would sell on airport bookstalls.
He made it. Yeah.
And A
Well,
Brief History of Time was one of the best-selling science books of all time, wasn't it?
it was, and you don't think of it as beach reading, but it is.
Yeah.
It really became pretty universal, and it did have a parts that were a bit overly technical. I think Stephen realized over the years, and that was our first book that we wrote together, A Briefer History of Time, where he asked me to help him rewrite it in a way that was less technical and made it a little bit clearer. It didn't need that book didn't need that much. There were just points where I think he was too close to the work, and this happens a lot when scientists write about their own research, too involved in the work, and so there were parts that were really quite technical. And so A Briefer History of Time, we rewrote it just to make it a little easier to read and to get through.
And you shaved pages out of it. The original, A Brief History of Time, was 240 pages. You made it about 35% shorter, and it's called A Briefer History of Time. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions on how communicators should make things more concise and accessible?
Well, it's really important. It's important to get the key ideas across, but not to waste time on things that are not important or not valuable. That's hard to do when you first write a talk or write a book. So that leads into the next step, which we call editing. And there's something that writers say, which is that first drafts are shitty, right? And you have to rewrite over and over again to really get it good. And that's true of talks, I think, as well. So just get your ideas down and then look at it after you have some time, some space, and look at it critically. When you first write, you're not supposed to look at it very critically, or you'll block all your good ideas. So write out your speech, your talk, give it a little time, go back to it and look at it critically, and ask yourself, if I had to, let's say you write it for a magazine, you get a certain word limit. I have to make it this long. What would you take out? That idea in your mind that you have to do it will help you find things to take out that you might otherwise be too close to, because we get married to our words, don't we? I have a file that I call cuts, and I found that rather than just cutting something and deleting it, I feel better about it if I'm not doing that. I just move it to the cuts file with the idea that I can always move it back, which I never do. But it makes it easier for me to kill my little ideas that I was so in love with. And I think that when you're writing a talk, you should do that. When I write op-eds for the New York Times fairly often, and we have a word limit, and I'll find that once I start going, I have to hit that word limit. It's unbelievable how many stuff you realize you don't really need. So you have to open your mind to that, and you have to let go. Letting go and opening your mind are the two, I think, keys.
Was Stephen Hawking a good editor? Was he able to cut through and say, okay, for this particular audience, maybe we're getting too technical or too much information?
He had a really good knack for that, actually. And you would think that for somebody who had such difficulty communicating or even writing, because I don't know if I should get into how he did that, but it was very tedious and exhausting, and he only could churn out words at his best about his best since I knew him was the last 20 years of his life, about 6 words a minute when he was doing well. Wow. For someone who had that much difficulty, he was had an amazing propensity to edit and to rewrite. He would go over every sentence, every word, time and time again to just get it right. He was a perfectionist.
It seems to me that in order to connect with non-experts in a field and to help people understand the types of ideas that you write about, storytelling is a powerful technique.
Oh, definitely. People love stories, and it pulls you along when you read a story. So it's not like your reading takes any effort. It's just something you're experiencing. And I think you remember the content better when there's a story behind it, rather than just having facts presented to you. So when I write a book, like for instance, Emotional, I first have all the ideas and I organize them, and I have the points I want to make. And then I start looking for how can I illustrate the point with a story. It can be, well, it can be something historical. It can be something humorous, something personal from my life. I look for incidents or stories that are memorable, that I can tell that illustrate that exact point. And that's where a lot of my work comes in, because it takes a long time to find some of the stories that I told that illustrate the points. But I search, I scour journals, the internet, talking to people, of course, my own personal experiences, and until I find something that's really, which I think is really compelling. And then when I tell it, I use my TV background, I think, because and TV, in the old days, at least, you were very, it was a very rigorous operation, or in a way, I felt like I had handcuffs on, because you had the format was very strict, and you had to have high points or jokes if it was a comedy before each commercial break, and you had only so many pages or minutes to do it in.
Wow.
And you got a feeling for pacing, and I think I've carried that through to my writing. So I have a good feeling for how many words to give each individual story beat, and how long the story should be, and how to bring it up to a crescendo, and then how to punch the point at the end.
Excellent. I'm going to have to reread the stories then to see the rhythm and the beats of that. That's a real skill. And I hope you appreciate the reason why I'm asking you about storytelling is because that's part of the reason why your books are bestsellers and they're so engaging. But what's interesting is that as a communication coach myself, I work with entrepreneurs and CEOs and leaders, especially in the sciences or very complex areas like cloud computing and high tech here in Silicon Valley. They don't see themselves as storytellers first. It's all about the data or the science, and that loses a lot of people. And that's why I think it's always important to remind folks that we are storytellers. We are a storytelling species. And if you want to connect with people, you have to do it through the vehicle of story. Emotional and your other books, those are good examples of science blended with storytelling.
Well, thank you. And by the way, I think that even when I give technical physics talks, and not only me, when other people do, if it's a good talk, that's a story too, even though you're not venturing as far as telling a story that is a metaphor for what your point is, or illustrating your point in some more abstract way. You pretty much have to stick with the science, but you still have a beginning, a middle, and end. You start out by raising questions in the audience's mind, and then you gradually answer them, and hopefully you find a way to excite them over the answers. So, I mean, even good technical talks are a kind of storytelling, even if you have to stick to the technical aspects of it. But to just stand up and relate facts without that connection between them, and that why do I want to know and where does this go being set up, then I think those talks, even if they're in physics departments, don't have a great impact. And I think that one of the things that makes certain physicists more successful than others is their ability to do that, both in their talks and when they write papers.
Leonard, let me touch on that briefly. You taught at Caltech, so you have a PhD in theoretical physics. You taught physics. Your research is very established in the field of physics. What role does writing play in a science career, whether it's physics or outside of physics? Do you think that writing is an important skill for people to cultivate?
I think,
or is it underestimated?
I think that virtually every scientist you ask would say that the writing and being able to get your ideas across is one of the key skills that you have. You have to have good ideas and do research that is interesting to people, but if you can't communicate it, you're not going to get it across. You know, these days there's a huge abundance of research, far more than ever before, and it's growing. The number of papers is growing, and scientists is growing exponentially. It's just ballooning, and it's very hard to keep up. I get a digest of papers in my field every day by email, and then there's a list. I can read the abstracts and see what the papers are about, and there's like 25, 35 every day. And it's just, so it's almost like the person goes into a bookstore and looking at the shelves and what makes your novel or your nonfiction book stand out. And if they flip through a few pages, what attracts them? It has to be really good writing. Wherever they open the book to, it's got to be good. And that's the same in physics papers today, because we have so many papers to look at, that the ones that are clear and written in a way where there's a development and it's almost really, it is story-like, that people can understand and that draws them in, is a great advantage to having people look at your work. So now, many decades ago, it was a little bit less like that because there wasn't so much work. And if you're a super genius and people do get to know you one way or another, they will dig through your work no matter how bad it is. I mean, there are famous physicists who were known for writing horribly incomprehensible papers, and yet they were so brilliant that people would take days and work through those papers. But those people are a handful a century. For most physicists, even for most really great physicists, it's important that you can write and express your ideas clearly, and I think with some sort of story-like development behind them.
Leonard, let's talk specifically about your new book, Emotional. The theme that I take away from having read the book is that emotion is just as important as rationality or logic when it comes to making decisions. And in fact, it's a celebration of our emotions, even emotions like anger or anxiety, because after all, no great social movement ever started without somebody being angry that someone else is being oppressed. So let's take that determination and motivation and use it for good. But it's also critical that we manage our emotions so they don't get the better of us. Would that be an appropriate summary of the book and the takeaway?
Yes, I think that's a good summary. I wrote the book because there's a revolution going on now in emotion research, and there's also been a huge, by the way, ballooning in the papers on emotion research. And what people are finding is that our old ideas about emotion are wrong. And one of the central points of the old ideas on emotion was that emotion is separate from rationality and that it's counterproductive, and it's neither. So you can't. Emotion not only aids your reasoning process, it helps you come to good decisions. It can't actually be separated from your rational reasoning. So when you think that you're executing purely logical, rational reasoning, that's emotion free, you're wrong. Emotion is always there guiding your reasoning. So those are the two main points that people have discovered. And scientists now know what each emotion does, how it affects your reasoning, and why it affects it in that way. And our emotions have evolved in order to have a beneficial effect according to the situation. So disgust, when you're in a situation where you're hungry and there's food around that's questionable, disgust plays a role. If you're walking down a dark street in a dangerous neighborhood, fear plays a role. Anxiety plays a role in all our lives. It keeps us observant about possible dangers. Too much anxiety drives us crazy and causes cortisol to go into our blood, and that's bad. Too little anxiety, by the way, is also bad. People have shorter lifespans if they have too little anxiety, and that's because they don't watch out for dangers. And that mole that's on their arm that someone else might go get checked out, maybe they won't get it checked out. So we need all our emotions have each specific emotion places your brain in a certain information processing state that determines how it works when it's making decisions.
I think that's fascinating. And I love this idea of, you expressed in the book, emotional contagion. Emotional contagion. Can you explain that concept? Because I think it is very valuable for leaders to understand that we pass on our emotions to others in our sphere.
Some of our emotions are called social emotions. Awe, embarrassment, jealousy, shame, guilt. Those emotions develop to help us cooperate and get along in nomadic societies when we were living in the wild. Human beings are not really suited to living than surviving on their own. And our species only survived because we banded together and we lived in groups. And so those are the social emotions.
So emotional contagion.
And so emotional, thank you. That's where I was going. So emotional contagion is part of that. So suppose that you're in a nomadic group and somebody is feeling sad. Well, that will make you feel sad. You have a tendency to feel sad. If they're fearful, you have a tendency to be fearful and to get on your toes too and look around, because we have to function as a group when we're living together in society. So if I didn't feel the sadness of somebody else, I might not go help them. If I didn't feel the danger when someone else sees the danger, then I might not react in the same way, and I may not react soon enough. So the emotional contagion is something that developed amongst humans to really to help us act together, to act cooperatively as one group. And what we have to realize is that happened in a certain specific lifestyle that we had, which was living as nomads. And we haven't evolved much since then. That we were living as nomads just tens of thousands of years ago. And our emotions haven't evolved much since then. That's a short on the evolutionary time scale. And yet our civilizations that we live in have evolved a great deal. And our life today is nothing like it was back then. So back then we may have been in contact with 10, 20, 30 people in a given day. Today we're in contact with hundreds or thousands of people. And that's just actually not natural for human beings. And what can happen is that this emotional contagion working through the media and through social media can be amplified and have huge effects on people. And some people can, if they know what they're doing, they use that to their own personal gain. You can attract people through the emotional contagion, or by inciting and stoking fear or anger, and then you get them to come back, and they feel that, but they also come back to your website or to your TV show, and it becomes a vicious circle. And if you're selling ads for that, or you want that to be a popular website or TV show, that could be beneficial to you. But that's one of the problems, I think, in today's society is that emotions are contagious, and sometimes negative emotions get amplified and passed around, and they manage to work up a certain furor in society that is counterproductive, I think.
And that's why, Leonard, we need to learn how to manage our emotions and to recognize when emotions are not beneficial, but are damaging.
So,
In your book, Emotional, you talk about the neuroscience research that shows there are 3 ways to manage our emotions before our emotions control us. They are acceptance, reappraisal, and expression. Can we briefly tackle each one?
Sure. So
first, acceptance. What does that mean?
Okay, so when I was talking about emotional contagion, I mentioned that this developed at a time when we lived much differently, and the same is true of each individual emotion that we have. And so there are times where emotions are counterproductive. It's not the rule, it's the exception. It's like just like we have optical illusions or we see mirages, those are exceptions. Normally our eyes are very useful to us, but there are times where they get out of hand. So for those cases, we have these 3, or there's more than 3, but 3 that I taught, main ones that I talk about, methods of emotion regulation. So acceptance really goes back to the ancient Greeks, to the Stoics. And the idea with acceptance is that you train yourself not to try to change things that you have no control over. So one example is if it's raining and you're having a picnic, you don't get angry at the rain. It just comes naturally to you not to get angry at the rain. And yet you be angry, you might get angry at somebody who cuts you off on the freeway in traffic. Well, why are you getting angry at that person? Because you can't change that person's behavior any more than you can change the rain. And so the idea in that case is to learn to recognize and to be mindful of what is under your control and what's not, and just not to waste and spend energy on what's not under your control. That is simply stated. It takes some practice to learn to exercise that, but actually you can do it. That's the important thing, is that you can You might think, well, how do I do that? Because I naturally get mad at the guy who cuts me off. But you don't have to, should realize you don't have to naturally get mad at that person. You can actually take control and rise above that, and learn to not get upset by things that you can't control. And
well, Leonard, I think that's why it's important that, we talk about this and that you've written about it in Emotional, because the first step is self-awareness, to be aware that there is a way to regulate your emotions. The second scientifically proven way to manage or regulate your emotions, I like that word, emotional regulation, is what you call, or is what other scientists also call, reappraisal, which you term the power of spin. So can you go into that a little bit? Because I know it definitely applies to public speaking anxiety and some people I've worked with. But reappraisal, please explain that.
Sure, that's actually a very good application of it in public speaking,
Mhm.
nervousness. But let's take, so when your brain creates an emotion, there's a certain process that happens, and your brain is taking into account sensory data, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, and the context that you're in, the pre-existing context, and all your memories and your thoughts, your feelings, your goals, and it creates an emotion. It's a very complex method, but it appraises the situation and you have an emotional experience. Reappraisal is named that because of that appraisal cycle. Reappraisal is when you try and go in and you alter that so a different emotion arises rather than the initial emotion. For example, and that is really by using your conscious mind to reinterpret the events that are going on in a way that will lead you away from that unwanted emotion. Okay. So let's take the car example. Someone cuts you off and you're angry. Mm-hmm. That's not a useful emotion, because nothing that you could, or nothing that's appropriate for you to do when that happens, other than just hang back and go, oh, well, and what did you really lose? 20 feet, right? At 60 miles an hour, it's not a lot of big loss, right? So the emotion is really not productive in that case. How do you change it? Well, the reason you get angry is you feel insulted, disrespected, taken advantage of. You feel like the guy must be an asshole, and all those things lead you to anger. Mm-hmm. Reappraisal means looking at the situation differently. Suppose, for example, that the person was just late for something, and so rather than thinking what an ass, you think that poor person must be really late and must be really stressed out right now. Or the person is just one of those oblivious people, and he or she will probably have an accident sometime, and poor them, because they don't live they're not mindful of their surroundings, and so they probably did it without even knowing that they were cutting me off. There's many different stories you can tell yourself.
Sure, but it's so empowering. It's so empowering, Leonard, because it changes your mindset and how you feel, which will help you make better decisions.
Yeah, exactly. And you can control the path that your brain goes down. And I have to make an important point. You have to believe the spin you're putting on it. You can't just say, I'm going to make up a story and try and believe that. You have to find some story or some spin that leads to a different emotion that is actually plausible to you. It is very plausible to me that the person's in a hurry, probably at least as often as the person being an ass is that they're just in a hurry or that they're oblivious. So you focus on that. And when you're talking about public speaking, I lost my nervousness a long time ago. I've given so many dozens and dozens of speeches in front of thousands of people. I've been on network
TED Talks too, which is the ultimate nerve-wracking experience.
Right, because you got that 18 minutes. I've been on network television, cable television many times, and I used to get nervous in the beginning. And then I started telling myself this great story, which is that even if I screw up, I'll be fine. Nothing bad is going to happen to me. I was led to that when I screwed up once or twice, and I was so stressed out. And then I noticed in the time following that people didn't even seem to remember that, or didn't care, or certainly nothing bad happened to me. My friends were still my friends. No one wrote articles about how I screwed up on TV or anything like that, and everything was fine. So if I was to be nervous on a show, I just tell myself, what am I being nervous about? Because I can screw up and nothing's going to happen. And so and I believe that story. I don't, since I believe
because you have evidence for it.
I have evidence for it,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And the third and a final way of managing our emotions is expression, the power of words. Here's what you write. You write that expressing unwanted negative emotion does help diffuse it. Talking is the most effective. Talking is the most effective when the sharing is done with trusted friends or a significant other. So, Leonard, are you suggesting that we should talk about our feelings?
Yes, I am. And that's another
Okay.
thing. When I was growing up, males at least were taught not to talk about their feelings, not to feel anything. You're a sissy if you cry and so forth.
You and me both. My parents were the World War II generation. My father was a prisoner of war. Separate story, but yeah, I think you and I have a very similar upbringing in terms of our immigrant parents.
Yeah, and so it turns out that that's the worst thing. It's called suppression, and that's the worst thing you can do. It doesn't help. First of all, it doesn't help you make better decisions or alleviate the problem that you were having, that you were trying to suppress. And secondly, it's very stressful on your body, and people who regularly suppress things have shorter lifespans as well. So it's interesting that scientists have studied all this. So expression is the opposite of that suppression. Expression is getting in touch with your feelings and letting them out. Something that has been previously more acceptable, I think, for women than for men. But but women had the right idea. It's the thing that you should do.
And now more men are opening up about their anxiety and how they've dealt with it. It seems to be more acceptable now to talk about it.
Definitely, it definitely is, and it's been studied a lot too, and amazing studies. Even some of the social media studies with hundreds of thousands of subjects as the experimental subjects that show that it really helps. And what it is, it's simple. I first started thinking about this when I worked for a few years in a corporation, and I was developing math education for a corporation and working on and sometimes someone in the corporation would piss me off. When you work in a corporation, that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens
a few times, once or twice.
Yeah, it happens in academia too. But there's a certain something about as they say, the stakes are so low in academia, and they're a little bit higher in the corporation. So, but anyway, I would get really angry at something, and I would write what we call flame email, which was I would write an email just digging into the person, telling them how awful they were. And then I would decide to send it the next day, have another look at it, which I always do. As I said, editing. So look at it the next day.
I think it's a very good idea, especially in these days of social media.
Yeah. And so I would, write it and I put it aside. And what I noticed was just the act of writing it relieved me, made me feel much better. And by the time I looked at it the next day, I didn't want to send it. I thought that would be really a good thing. It was a good thing I didn't send it. But getting it out really diffuses it. And whether it's writing something or talking to somebody, that's a very good method of diffusing an overly intense emotion.
Interesting. So that is one way of reaching that state of emotional balance and managing our emotions before they control us.
Right.
Okay. Got it. Expression, the power of words. Excellent stuff, Leonard. I'm so happy you wrote Emotional. Again, because it's such a storytelling based book, that you balance the science with the story, and it really is a page turner because of the stories. So thank you for writing Emotional, and thank you for taking a few minutes of your time with me. It's really a joy to meet you. As I told you, I'm a fanboy. So now I'm going to go back and read some of your other books that I haven't read, like the one not with Stephen Hawking, but I believe you wrote a book about your relationship with Stephen Hawking. Is that right? I haven't read that.
Yeah, Stephen Hawking, a memoir of friendship and physics. And
I love it.
I love that. That was one of my favorite books. So I hope.
Oh, terrific. Okay, I'll look that one up too. Thank you, Leonard.
Thank you. It's been fun.